Back in the 1700s, the fashion industry had found its apex, I suppose, of that era, in a small critter that was ubiquitous here in North America, spread out across the continent, industrious, eager, and very lovely, as it turned out. It's called the beaver. North American beaver. There were beavers in Europe. They were familiar with the beaver, but not the North American beaver. The North American beaver was, by all accounts, superior to the European beaver. Why? Well, it was seen as industrious on a scale that the European beaver had never been seen before like that. The American beaver, the North American beaver, was the subject of books and lectures and newspaper articles, and all the way even up to 1914, there were myths about the North American beaver that they're silly to look at now. I mean, we look at it now and it's like, what the hell are they talking about? They actually wrote books in which they talked about the kingdom of the beavers and how the beavers were a society almost equal to that of man. They were, again, industrious, but they had kings and queens, and they had leaders, and they had people that would run things and even punish other beavers that weren't working hard enough. I'm not making any of this up, folks. This is actually an illustration from a book about ye industrious beaver of North America. It was, again, we see it as silly now, but there were so many myths and so many assumptions made about the beaver that these things were being published even into 1914. Books were still being published about how the beavers in North America were almost human in their society. But, of course, the beavers had something that humans wanted, that pelt. What did we want that pelt for? Well, we wanted it because you could turn it into a hat. And beaver pelt hats were, to put it simply, all the rage from the late 1600s all the way to the 1840s. In fact, the only reason beaver pelt hats went away at all was because of silk. If it hadn't been for silk, we'd probably still be wearing beaver hats that could be molded and shaped and put into all kinds of different style of hats. It was rather remarkable. Benjamin Franklin's beaver hat that he wore in Paris was a simple rustic fur, basically just planted on his head. And it was seen, everything Franklin did was for a reason. It was seen as symbolic of the North Americans, and particularly the Colonials. When he wore this in Paris, when he was there, it was seen as sort of an American thing. And American things in those days were kind of cool in France. That's back when they actually liked us. And so seeing Franklin wear the beaver hat just made it all the more popular. In fact, George Washington himself wore beaver felt hats. In his own description of his beaver hat was a fine beaver hat for a really large head that he wore when he crossed the Delaware River wearing a beaver hat made from beaver. James I, King of England and Scotland, wore a beaver felt hat. It led to this connotation, this idea of the beaver gallant, the gallant beaver. It had connotation, the hat, the beaver hat, and the beaver itself had this connotation of nobility. To wear a beaver felt hat, to own a beaver hat, meant that you were noble. It meant that you represented something of particular value in that culture. in that era. Nowadays, of course, you don't see a whole lot of beaver pelt hats. There's a couple reasons for that. One, frankly, they're not all that comfortable. I have worn one once in my life. They weren't, they're warm. They'll keep your head warm. That's for sure. Much like Ben Franklin's. That's why he said he wore it. Keeps my head warm. But like I said, they've been replaced. And the reasons for that replacement were more than just the shifting societal values and fashion values. The replacement was silk. It was the realization later on, well into the 1900s, that the beaver was endangered because of this beaver pelt trade. And that was a problem. But that's another story. In the 1700s, particularly let's say 1750-ish, the American colonials were starting to have their issues, of course, with the British Crown. We all know this. This is history that's very familiar to us. The eastern seaboard of the United States was, of what would become the United States, then it was England, was restless and not happy with the way things were going. But it represented about 1/7 of the entire continent of North America and what the heck was going on in the rest of the country out there. There's a lack of knowledge about this. There's this idea that we don't even have a clue as to what was going on in the rest of the country. Now, I know there's a few people out there that, oh, I knew all that. I read National Geographic. I knew all about that. But I'm a historian. I knew there was a rest of the continent, but I didn't know what the heck was going on there until I started reading about it a couple of weeks ago. What you have to understand about North America is that there was, competing claims. In the pre-era of the American Revolution, let's just call it 1750, 1760, there were, of course, three major powers on the North American continent. England, which had the 13 colonies. France, which basically had everything else in what would eventually become the United States and Canada. And Spain. And even this map that you're looking at here, if you're watching the video, isn't quite correct, because by this point, Spain had actually conquered what they called Alta California, what we call today the state of California, and much of Utah and Colorado and Nevada. Conquered is kind of a interesting phrase. At no point when the Spaniards took over, when Spain took over California, Alta California, at no point did they ever have more than 1,000 troops in the state of California. It's hard to believe. It's hard to imagine. But Spain essentially conquered the United States Southwest, conquered, conquistador, took over, however you want to look at it, with very few actual military men. Primarily, they did it with priests and with trade. There was a need for some military people because they were terrified of the Russians coming down from Alaska, but they just didn't have them. And it didn't matter how much they cried to the King of Spain, he just wouldn't give it to them. Pretty much the same thing was happening to the French in the middle. They understood that this vast territory that they owned needed to be defended and needed to be mined and needed to be taken care of, but there just wasn't any money to do it. And England, of course, had their own problems with the colonies, but there you go. Now, the problem we have today is we look at this map, and it looks very familiar to us. We see the states, the 48 states laid out there. We see Canada and Mexico laid out there, and it looks to us very familiar. What we don't grasp is that in 1750, let's say 1763, very little of this made sense to anybody in the world. In fact, Virginia, the colony of Virginia, basically claimed an unfettered border to the west of the state. They had no idea what was out there, but they claimed that. France claimed everything in the middle, what they called Louisiana, which would shift in its shape over the years. And the Spanish, of course, claimed the West, although they had very little idea of actually what was there. This is so weird because they literally didn't know what was out there. They knew the Mississippi River as well as they could, but that was pretty much it. They knew the Hudson Bay. They knew the Great Lakes. But basically everything west of the Mississippi River all the way to the west coast, the San Francisco Bay, was a giant blank. And this caused a lot of confusion and a lot of problems. Mostly because people, ignorant people, figured nobody would know the difference, and so they just started writing things about it. They just started filling in the blanks. They had no knowledge. They'd never been there. They'd never seen it. They'd never laid eyes on it. But they just drew maps of it anyway. They wrote about it. They wrote about what they expected to find. And of course, as it turned out, none of it came true. The French and Spanish claims butted up against the American claims. And while the French saw things slightly different than the Spanish saw the Native American tribes as a hindrance and a necessity. The Spanish saw the Indian tribes as the goal to be converted to Christianity. That's almost their entire motivation. We think about the conquistadors 200 years before that in South American, Central American gold. But when it came to the American West, the Spanish goal was conversion to Christianity. Their books are full of their stories of how they converted, how much work they went through, how many hundreds of miles they walked through deserts and parched land to convert 3 or 4 Native Americans to Christianity. It's bizarre to look at it now and go back to that. The French, of course, saw it much differently. They were really into the beaver pelts, and they saw Louisiana, which was, of course, much bigger than we think of the state of Louisiana. Louisiana was basically the entire center portion of the country in Canada. They saw this as beaver heaven, and they were about beaver pelts. And they enlisted the help of the Native American tribes. Really, why should we do all the work when the Native Americans can do the work and we can benefit? The English were much the same way. And it was this conflict over resources between the French and the English that led to the French and American War, or as I like to call it, the First World War before the First World War. The rest of the world calls it the 7-Year War. We called it the French and Indian War. Most people look at it just the American theater of the 7 Years' War, or as the French called it, the War of Conquest. They were out to conquer the world. They wanted to gain the land of North America because the land of North America was rich in beavers, and beavers were the gold coin of North America. Beavers were the thing, and so they wanted to conquer the whole world, and North America is part of that, so that they could basically corner the beaver trade. It's not the only reason, I know, but this thought went into this, that the more beaver pelts we have, the better. And the weird part about these beaver pelts is, and this is the reason why they enlisted the Indians' help for trapping, was they didn't like the fresh beaver pelts. This is weird, but it's true. They liked the supple beaver pelts. In other words, beaver pelts that had been worn in. And so what they would basically do is the Native Americans would come in with all these beaver pelts to sell, and they would say, no, we want to buy the one you're wearing. But I've been wearing this for like 2 years. Yeah, we know. That's the one we want. So then they would take that, turn it into a hat after they shipped it back to France, and some guy would put that sweaty, sweat-worn beaver pelt on his head and go, look, I am noble, beaver gallant. Anyway, French and Indian, there's a point to all this. Stay with me. The French and Indian War did not go France's way, as you know. And this led to the Treaty of 1763, which ended the French and Indian War in North America, and of course was the real catalyst for England's Parliament trying to tax the colonists without representation, and almost directly leading to the American Revolution. The treaty was signed in Paris. It's called the Treaty of Paris, 1763. It was signed by a bunch of men who literally had never set foot in the Western Hemisphere. They had no idea what they were even talking about. They really didn't. In fact, the king, King George III, was confused at one point. He couldn't understand the difference between the Ganges River and the Mississippi River. I mean, Indians live along the shores, right? They must be the same thing. It's utterly ridiculous for us to look at this now and say to ourselves, how did these people manage to actually divide up what would become Louisiana, the center part of the North American continent, to end this war, this world war, of which we were part? Again, signed in Paris by men who never saw North America, who believed that the native tribes in America could simply be bought off or intimidated, and they had to keep the Russians out. They knew that there was a mighty river called the Mississippi that ran down right down the middle of the Mississippi, right down the middle of Louisiana. And that was really going to become the key focal point. The Louisiana question would be the entirety of answering here. Now, you probably know that Louisiana, the territory, would eventually be sold to the United States by France in 1803. Napoleon needed money for his war, and so he would sell it. But how did it get to that point? Well, in the Treaty of 1763 that ended the French and Indian War, France gave Spain Louisiana, except, of course, for New Orleans. So if you're looking at the map, basically they gave England everything to the east of the Mississippi River and Spain everything to the west of the Mississippi River. So this meant that Louisiana went to Spain. Well, wait, Dave, we bought it from France 40 years later, 50 years later. How did that happen? Well, I'm kind of kidding. They actually gave it to Spain in 1762 before the treaty was signed. They didn't announce it until 1764, and they kept New Orleans for strategic reasons, because New Orleans is, of course, at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and you can't get into the Mississippi River without going past New Orleans, assuming it's not underwater at that point. In 1800, at the height of Napoleon's beginnings, I guess, in the end of the French Republic, Spain had declared war on France over the issues with the Republicans, with the French Republicans executing their king. This upset the monarchies. Spain declared war on France because of all this. Spain got their butt kicked by France, which is how France ended up with half of the island in the Caribbean, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And Spain had to give Louisiana back to France because Spain was discovering that these Indian tribes were not all that cooperative. And even worse, the Mississippi River, although it was the boundary between England and Spain, wasn't all that certain of a boundary. And colonialists in America, Native American tribes, tended to not pay any attention to it, and Spain was getting tired of dealing with it. Remember when I said they conquered Alta California with about 1,000 people? Well, they didn't have another 1,000 people to go in and conquer Louisiana. And so that's how France got Louisiana back from Spain after having given it to them, and then turned around 3 years later and sold it to us because, well, they were having the same problem. They were in the middle of a world war, and the Second World War, before the Second World War, and they just didn't want to deal with it. So they sold it to us, and you know the rest of the history. We went on from there to manifest destiny and discover all these things. But the weird thing about all this is a couple of things. During all this is going on, beaver pelts are still being harvested. In fact, means are being discovered of trapping beaver that are almost inhumane and cruel. They discover that they can, how do I put this delicately? Alex said it best yesterday. They discovered beaver squeezins, which is basically castor oil from a beaver. And they can scent the traps with this sexual gland oil that they get from the beavers they've killed already, and the other beavers will come running. And They're killing beavers on an industrial scale. And what they don't realize at the time is that this is changing the climate. It's changing the environment of North America because the beavers are disappearing and being hunted to extinction. And the remarkable changes in our climate that are caused by this are unprecedented. We're all familiar with what happened to the bison a few years later. We understand that. But the beaver being hunted almost to the verge of extinction and not being saved by any altruistic idea. The only thing that saved the beaver was it went out of style. Hard to believe, but it's true. When you think about this, we almost wiped out the beavers because we, as a species, wanted to look good. We knew nothing about the beaver. We didn't really, I mean, we had myths and we had ideas and we knew nothing about it, but we traded men, we traded land like we did. We didn't know anything about the North American continent. The Treaty of 1763 was signed with the idea that the Mississippi River would be the boundary and everything would be fine and dandy. By men who had never seen it. Did you know that until 1843, again, for us, it's easy to look at. We look at that map and we go, makes sense to me. Until 1843, everyone knew, everyone was convinced that there had to be a navigable river path from the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast. There had to be. Because there wasn't Europe. This is the way it's always worked. And they knew nothing about it. They were trading land with tribes and colonies and people who lived there and who had lived there for generations, and they didn't care. They just assumed that everybody would listen to what they said and went, okay, so now we're French or Spanish or English or whatever, and we're just supposed to abide by your rules? One colonial wrote, England has no more claim to the North American continent than it does to the moon. It was insanity. The knowledge that we didn't have, that we lacked, that we assumed that we did because we had beaver hats on our heads that made us look noble and made us look cool, were insane to us today. It wasn't that long ago, by the way. It was a little over 200 years ago. One of the things that was noted was that their ignorance did not breed caution. The fact that they didn't know anything about what they were actually talking about didn't seem to matter to them. They looked good, and they believed that they were men of power, and so they just traded lives and land and beavers like commodities, like stockbrokers, without ever actually understanding the relationship between the beaver and the land, and the Native Americans and the land, and the Colonials and the land, and where the Mississippi River as a border. I mean, if you think about that for more than 10 seconds, you're going to realize why that's an absurd idea. Mississippi River moves a lot. The whole idea was insane. The whole process was fraught with assumptions and ignorance and no caution. Nobody ever stopped to say to themselves, the beginning of wisdom is what we don't know. Nobody ever stopped to say to themselves, maybe we should slow down. Maybe we should think about this first. Maybe we should consider things rather than simply, rushing in to where we don't necessarily belong. Or if we're going to go there, maybe we should go there in a different way. 200 years later, does anybody even care? Does anybody even know this history? Does anybody even think about this stuff? I mean, we know our recent history, and we see protests, and we see people screaming about things, and we see people talking about that evil Columbus, those evil colonies. We never hear anything about, Alta California or Russia or any of those places, do we? Ignorance did not breed caution, was the warning that the historians have come up with about this particular era in our epic as a human species. 200 years after the fact, it's like we don't even care. And what I'm wondering is, in 200 years from now, what will be said of us? We're doing a lot of things right now that we don't really understand or know anything about. And ignorance is not breeding caution. We're not saying to ourselves, hey, wait a sec, let's think about this. We're just simply charging through and grabbing all the beaver pelts we can so that we look good, so we sound good. And ultimately, in 200 years, will they say of us, ignorance did not breed caution?